Welcome to the Water Shelf Podcast, where we dive into the wonderful world of water books. The Water Shelf is a production of Maven's Notebook, California's Water News Central. My name is Justin Scott-Coe, water manager, pirate, and book aficionado. More information on the Water Shelf and Maven's Notebook will be provided at the end of this episode. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Cristy Clark to the Water Shelf Podcast. Dr. Clark is an associate professor at the Canberra Law School. Her research and academic writing focuses on the human right to water, legal geography, and the intersection of human rights and the environment. She is the co-author with John Page of The Lawful Forest, A Critical History of Property, Protest, and Spatial Justice, published in 2022, which won the 2023 Penny Pether Prize. And more recently, she has written the book we will be discussing today, Legal Geographies of Water, the Spaces, Places, and Narratives of the Human-Water Relations, published by Erskine Routledge in 2025. Cristy, it just gives me such a great pleasure to welcome you to the Water Shelf Podcast.
It's very lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I wanted to first start with the whole idea of human water relations. It's in the subtitle of your book, and obviously there's so many different aspects to the human water relations. We drink it, we live next to it or near it, it falls on us, it floods us, it feeds us, it frankly is us. It's most of what constitutes our bodies. And your focus is on the legal geography of that human water relation. I was wondering if you could start just by talking about what is legal geography and how does it help inform us about our relationship to water?
Yeah, sure. So legal geography is one of those sort of law and kind of sub-disciplines. It's where we bring another discipline into conversation with legal, doctrinal analysis and those sorts of things. And human geography is the particular focus within the sort of law and geography. And so human geography is particularly focused on concepts of place and space and issues of sort of, scale in governance and scale in, physical geography as well. And so, and the way that I guess narrative shapes our understanding of space and place and what it means. So it's sort of the ways that a physical space might be transformed by the ways that humans conceptualize it. So they might call it a country and suddenly the boundaries become meaningful in terms of how we understand it, what it means. And so all of those things are the subject of human geography. When they come into conversation with law, we look at how the law plays a role in that process. And geographers and legal geographers call it a co-constitutive process, which was really just kind of a jargony way of saying that the two things usually act on each other in a way that means that they can't be independent of each other. And so the way that humans conceptualize space and the way that a place is in itself, they come together and they create something more than the sum of, they constitute each other.
Huh.
So when we talk about law, we sort of say, well, law doesn't act in a vacuum. Law acts in a context, but it doesn't just get affected by that context. It actually changes that context. So going back to my idea of a country, when we talk about a legal boundary, then that changes how we understand the edge of a space. And then it changes how we behave towards it and how we shape it through our own infrastructure or physical behaviour. And so this back and forth is sort of the subject of legal geography. When we're looking at water, rather than being the boundary of a country, we might talk about how the law both is affected by the way that water behaves, by the fact that it isn't very easy to control, that it floods, it disappears or whatever it be, but also that water is affected by our laws. If we decide that people upstream can take as much as they want, then the amount of water downstream is going to be affected by that legal decision, as just one example. And there's this whole range of things that start to be affected by that relationship between law and water. But we, as you mentioned, we have relationships with water. We are water. So that kind of entangled relationship is a kind of a fundamental feature as well. So I sort of look at it rather than a two-way, I look at it as a triangle. There's got water on the one part of the triangle, law on another, and then the third one is those relationships between. And so when you look at those three things together, each actually acting somewhat independently, we get to where we are, and it's complicated. And trying to work out what it means, and maybe how we could do it differently, or where we could tweak what we do is kind of the subject of the book, I guess.
Well, let's get to that. Boy, it is complicated and it is fascinating. It is, I would say the reason I work in water is just such the fascinating complications that could come into being, and oftentimes in the legal realm. I was joking with you before we started recording about constantly being involved in the legal aspects of water and enjoying your book because it seems to give such a broader and more elemental context to what oftentimes is just a whole bunch of water lawyers fighting each other, right? Um, so let's dive into the book and how you make sense of that complication. What's the argument or thesis of your book? What are you trying to say that legal geography does in terms of helping us understand our relations with water or improve our relations with water?
Yeah, I think that the kind of the central benefit of bringing that kind of legal geography lens or a sort of analysis to the issue is I think it allows us to step back and look at these different players, and how they have been affected by what I've sort of described as these different ideologies of water governance, which have
Hmm.
kind of been a bit of a feature of the last more than 4 decades. And the book kind of starts by explaining that in the 70s, uh, globally, the conversation about our water problem, a crisis, started to really ramp up. And,
Right.
it took place in the UN, but in a lot of other forums. And people became concerned about the fact that something that perhaps at a global level we'd always thought of was fairly unproblematic. Obviously, at local levels, people had droughts or floods or whatever it be, but we kind of thought overall the water cycle was taking care of itself. We started to sort of think that the human engagement with the water cycle and maybe the number of people on the planet meant that we were going to hit this crisis. And a lot of it's been described as scarcity, but there was a whole range of other issues. It was kind of this growing conversation about the idea of crisis, and the need for us to be maybe a bit more reflective and a bit more careful about governance and how we managed water and what sort of structures we set up for water law and policy and for how we would behave in relation to what we did with water. And at the beginning of that, I think there kind of were two, sometimes complementary, sometimes competing ways of looking at it. And one was we needed to place an economic value on water in order to stop wasting it. That we
Right.
didn't think that water had any value, we treated it as free, and as a result, it was just being wasted. And we needed to be more efficient. We needed to place an economic value on it to stop this unsustainable. And the sustainable, it's a bit kind of it's slippery, right? Do we
Yes.
mean environmental or do we mean financial?
Yes.
And sometimes that slipperiness helped people who were sort of having those conversations. But that was one narrative. And then the other one was that there was a human right to water, or that the people had these basic needs for water, for survival, to grow food, or for hygiene, and that this needed to be taken care of. That was a whole reason for being efficient, or for managing this crisis. And those two ideologies, I guess, started to shape water governance in different ways, um, at the international level, but also in different domestic contexts. And so the early part of the book tries to sort of chronologically look at how we sort of started to experiment with, well, what would that look like on the ground? And to provide some case studies of probably places which might be a bit archetypal. So in the early ones, when we talk about that first introduction of a very kind of market-based approach to water governance, could be described as neoliberal, in fact. We look at Chile and the UK. Chile, which was the first country to really liberalize its rural water markets and to sort of create water markets, and the UK, which fully divested its public water and sanitation system and sold it off to private corporations under the Thatcher administration. So these were the first two kind of big experiments with this idea. And one of my arguments there is that when we step back and we look at that from a legal geography perspective, and we look at these different ways that this co-constitutive process of the way that law started to shape human relations with water by through these changes, but then that those same human relations were acting back on the law. I think it helps us to understand some of what was going on that maybe remains debated today. And one of those is that by placing an economic value on water, yeah, arguably there is this idea of stopping people from treating it like it's worthless. I mean, it's not a dispute that that's the case, but also that process of commodifying water messed with people's relationship. It didn't actually accord with the way that people really inherently felt about water. It's not a widget for buying and selling. It's
No,
not
it's not.
something that people were very comfortable with the idea, for example, in Chile, of separating from land and selling off. Farmers actually didn't want to participate in these water markets. They saw it as being incredibly important to keep those water rights with the land that they farmed. So there were all of these things about people's inherent feelings about their relationship with water, which didn't match these new reforms and which created a lot of friction in the implementation process. And I guess I'm building there the argument that that friction is kind of inherent, that there's actually something kind of that doesn't match between this kind of way of thinking that we're going to make things better and how people really do behave around water and feel about water. And then I'm sneaking in there at the beginning this idea that maybe water has its own agenda here and it doesn't agree either.
Yes.
That the water is not willing to be managed in that way and it shouldn't show itself through a whole variety of ways. And in the UK, an example there is the Yorkshire drought. So, you can say, we've got this amount of water, we're going to sell it for this year at this price, and then water's not there. It doesn't come to the party. It's got its own agenda. And you don't even need to believe in it having, a being living or agentic to know that it's just its material self means that we can't actually just put it onto a financial spreadsheet and make it work in that way. There's something separate. So I guess that's the starting point. I should stop talking for a bit there.
No, I'm loving it because there's so many echoes going in my head with what you're saying, and at least my experience, which is only in the context of the United States and Western in particular, California. But the environmental movement in the 70s, born the Earth Day and all of that from rivers lighting on fire and all the pollution, then the Clean Water Act, the drinking, and the various federal legislation that led to our water quality standards, and then weird commodification schemes that happened in the United States in various different areas that we're still trying to figure out and work out, and we're fighting about, and to enter into that. One thing I want to raise with you directly, because it is a major issue that we're dealing with, and we're not quite sure. I don't think anyone really understands it in the sort of water sector, so to speak, although we're all talking about it, is the human right to water. And you've raised that. It's something that you're an expert on. I'd love to hear more about what does the human right to water mean. I know it created a lot of concerns in the public water sector as far as, does this mean people don't have to pay their water bills, that our economics get thrown up, or, how do we figure out because, I run a public water agency. The people I serve water to own my agency. I work for them. They're my bosses. So I certainly think they have a right to the water that I'm providing to them. It's theirs. But how does the human right to water come into being, or come into and insert itself into this neoliberal kind of marketplace of water, where we're buying and selling on a constant basis to ensure that all basic needs are met, or even beyond the basic needs of water are met? I don't know if that question makes sense to you, but I'm sure you can, make it sound much more eloquent than what I asked.
Yeah, so the human right to water, at the international level, I guess it emerged over a process of quite a long period of
Yeah,
time. There was a number of decades in which there was sort of, it would come up in these sort of, UN declarations or similar sort of international conversations and declarations. There would be an acknowledgement that humans have a right to water, and then would sort of shift maybe 10 years later into describing it as a human need. And then
right.
we'd sort of flip back to human right to water. And it kind of, it didn't really reach a kind of a point of coalescing as being kind of fully recognized in international human rights law until the 2000s. And in the 2000s, first of all, we had what's described as General Comment Number 15, which is where the committee that's responsible for the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights sort of said, look, the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to the highest attainable standard of health, which are two recognised rights under the Convention or the Covenant, they imply a human right to water because you can't actually attain those two things unless you have an adequate, and so they described it as a sufficient amount of affordable, acceptable water to meet basic needs. So it wasn't kind of, oh, I just knocked my microphone, my apologies. It wasn't, as much water as you want, and it
Right.
wasn't necessarily free, although that's one
Right.
area of sort of ongoing debate. But it needed to be sufficient, it needed to be affordable, and it needed to be accessible and acceptable. And then the debates begin, right? Because what do
Sure.
all of those words really mean? What are their kind of normative content? So sufficient, um, there's kind of long been a debate between is that enough for mere survival or is that enough for flourishing or dignity rights? And we've started to kind of generally move more towards dignity and a degree of flourishing than just bare survival. Um, but that's probably around 75 to 100 litres of water per person per day. And sometimes less if it's, in a state of drought or if it's in a disaster situation. In extreme disaster situations, it's 12 and a half as an example. But you're not having showers or washing your clothes in that kind of context. And, waterborne sanitation creates sort of additional needs. Health issues, a need for, higher levels of hygiene because of HIV, things like that come into
Mhm.
it. So that's sufficient. Affordable, that's where there has always been debate because there is an argument that in some contexts, free is the only affordable measure. Because for some people, they have so little, I guess, cash flow that if they're paying anything for water, then they're having to reduce food, healthcare, etc. But otherwise, it's kind of generally considered to be around 3% of a household income that's considered to be affordable. And there's also some debates, particularly in Ireland, for example, which is that, well, we already pay for water through the general taxation system, so we shouldn't have to pay twice. And when you've got water coming from the sky most days,
Right.
the idea that you need to manage it through sort of cost signals is less popular than, for example, in Australia, where I don't think people have quite that same concern. They recognise that they don't want people wasting water because there's not much. So some of this is context specific. Acceptable is more just in terms of things like it doesn't taste bad, it's not a disgusting color, it's, all of those things. And I think, Flint, Michigan is an example of where you can start seeing unacceptable water. It's your first signal that it's probably also not very healthy. So
Yes.
that's not a bad measure. And then accessible over time has started to mean probably inside the house,
Mm.
not a 200-meter walk, not
Yes.
all of the day for often women and children who miss education and work as a result of having to go and collect. But also because when it's inside the house, people's hygiene standards are significantly elevated. And so it has a significant effect on the right to health. And these are issues that are often associated with the global south, for example. They're often issues that we associate with countries that have much higher levels of poverty, but similar issues can be seen in most countries. And I think the US is increasingly aware of the fact that even within a very, very wealthy country, high levels of inequality, not just in income, but also in terms of, I guess, environmental justice measures, mean that there are pockets where people actually do experience similar concerns around deprivation due to water disconnections or contamination or things of that nature, or unaffordable bills. So some of those things play out everywhere.
Yes. They certainly do, and we're having those conversations, and I think they're very beneficial for all of us. That was a great explanation. I deeply appreciate it. Um, you mentioned, going kind of to the legal geographies, it's a very place-based kind of focus, right, on how to understand the human right to water, to understand it. I want to get to the ontologies of water and, the realities of water, the materiality of water, as you described it. But you say the place-based focus on water rights, and I think this makes a lot of sense, creates a wonderful phrase in your introduction, a pluriverse of water realities. And I think that matches everybody's experience. It's very different. Water, just as you described, Ireland is very different from certain parts of Australia, certainly parts of California. Even within California, there's water-rich and water-poor zones. Very different experience of water. How can the specific nature of each place's human water reality in relationship to that reality be understood kind of in a general framework, like you just described, the the human right to water, but also just the reality of water. How do you understand such a diversity of relationships in a general way? Does that question make sense?
Yeah,
Oh, good.
I think that is actually it's the biggest challenge
Yeah,
because increasingly we do want to create global solutions, to issues. We want these frameworks that we can apply everywhere. And as soon as we start making those frameworks too specific or too generic and specific, we start to wipe out that diversity that does exist, and we start to
yeah,
make it very difficult for that place-based sort of responsiveness to be possible. So, as an example, if we go back to the human right to water, that's why it's not described as a certain number of litres. Words like sufficient, acceptable, they're interpreted in context. So
sure.
what's acceptable to me or in my context might be very different from what's acceptable in a different context. And what's affordable is certainly going to be very different in different contexts, even within the one city, right? And
Yes.
so some of those, by having those words that are context, like interpreted in context or context specific, that's one way that we can start to do it. But the other way is really, it kind of goes to the kind of governance that we think is going to work. And I think the deeper the democracy, the deeper there is around allowing for community input into the minutiae of those decisions, the more responsive it's going to be to local context. So if it's coming in from the national government from above with these cookie cutter frameworks and prices and tariff rates and all those things, and it's just being applied everywhere with no conversation and no input from community, it's very unlikely to be responsive to context. It's very unlikely to fit. Um, but if it actually, through its framework, enables community input and a level of community control, then it's kind of automatically going to respond to it. And the form of that control or democracy is going to itself need to be responsive to how diverse is the community, and how do you enable the kinds of, I guess, deliberative processes to enable them to hear and to see each other's realities. And so that's about being a bit attentive to power dynamics.
Mm,
If you have a majority who have a very particular way of relating to water and understanding what water is, but a decent sized minority that has less power but sees it very differently, then a majoritarian rules process is not going to sort that out. It's going to have to deal with those power dynamics in order to make those adjustments work. Yeah.
Fascinating. I mean, the water and democracy and the water and governance area of conversation is just absolutely fascinating. I'm, part of a political unit providing water service and very small. But it's just such a big topic. It's such a big issue, and it's an international issue, and oftentimes I find in conversations a penchant to say, if you're small, you can't really provide the level of service that larger water, agencies can provide. And I've always thought, but the small ones get to hear much more closely to the actual constituents, the literal constituents, meaning the voters, but also the constituents in the water. That there's a stronger connection, a democratic connection, and that seems to come out of what you said and really reflect strongly with me. I want to talk about that. This brought me back as well to my college philosophy classes, the ontologies of living waters. This chapter 7 in your book, just blew my mind, and I would love for you to just talk a little bit about the what you call the new ontological turn in understanding water as a living entity, and also how it's a new idea, but it's based really on an old idea, and that indigenous communities are really helping us trying to understand how water can have rights of its own, can its own materiality, can speak into the legal system as you prior described, and speak a few words just about what does that mean, the ontology of water, and how does that help us
Yeah.
understand human water relations?
Yeah. So ontology is often defined as being the lens through which we understand the world. And then I think people split on what they mean by lens. How significant is that word lens? So is there just one world with, physics and, it's measurable and it's objective and it's there and we all have the same one, but we're looking at it through perhaps a different color or different refractions. And so then the lens is the most specific part of what we mean by ontology. And that's why sometimes ontology will be translated as worldview,
Hmm.
how you're looking at the world. But another definition of ontology, and it's probably a bit more of it's kind of a political intervention to define it this way. And it's a little bit tied to, I guess, decolonial thinking, is to say actually there's not this single world. We don't, the lens is our world by very nature of the fact that we are entangled. And so we live in different worlds. There's a pluriverse.
Hmm.
And we're probably more familiar with that now because of movies.
Right.
you know,
Yes.
so we do have these movies which talk about these pluriverses, but it's not really meant in terms of, like sliding through portals or anything like
Right.
that. It's more that actually you can't separate a lens from reality. And in fact, that it that inseparability means that we're actually living in different worlds. And from the political connotations or the consequences of seeing that mean that we need to stop governing things or creating laws based on a default singular reality. So one criticism that's been made of, I guess, Western or colonial thinking is that we live, and only we, live in this one world, the one where there's this objective world, and other people are just looking at it through maybe distorted lenses.
Hmm.
So we actually see other ways of looking at the world. We describe them in words that kind of denigrate what they are. We describe them as sort of mystical or fantasy, and whereas ours are real. Our
Right.
science is, objective. It's fact based. We've got it right. And other ways of understanding the world are they're interesting. They're a bit, that they haven't quite understood the real world, but we can tolerate them. And so it becomes it's built on a hierarchy of knowledges, and ours is at the top in that context. And we do a lot of reflexive lawmaking, even at the international level, perhaps particularly at the international level, that's based on this idea that we know what's real and other people are kind of over there in their fairyland, not knowing what's real. And then when our objective perfect science discovers something that Indigenous people have been telling us for the last 1,000 years. Now it's real because we've verified it. And
Right.
for some reason, we don't pause and think, gee, the fact we didn't know it before might tell us something else. It's just like, oh, isn't it great?
Yeah.
Science has discovered that trees talk to each other through mycelium in the soil. Yeah, like so. There's all these. So that's that kind of that's that conversation that's taking place at the moment around what we mean by an ontological turn.
Hmm.
And I think the term first kind of, I think, took root in anthropology because anthropologists, of course, were pretty guilty of doing that and
Sure.
have started to sort of say, okay, we're actually needing to not come in as these kind of colonial overlords who judge the merits of other cultures, but we might have something to learn here. In the legal context, it throws up a lot of challenges because if we have, in fact, always governed as though we just have this singular reality, this singular world, um, and if that's not the case, then, if you go back to those governance conversations that we're having before, it's not just about having some different constituencies that see things a little bit differently. We actually have these different worlds, these people living in different realities. And so then how do you bring those together? But maybe it actually makes it easier because we start to understand the depths of what we're dealing with. And so we do see these new legal frameworks which are starting to emerge, which are trying to actually genuinely grapple with that ontological pluralism, the pluriverse that does exist. And it's happening particularly in colonial contexts where it's much more visible because you have an Indigenous population who have maintained a degree of sovereignty within their own spaces and who can input into those conversations some understanding of those ontologies that they live within and the law that goes with those ontologies. And then we have a kind of a modernist or a Western ontology and law that comes into conversation. And so we're starting to see these new laws, including in relation to rivers, which try to bring those two into conversation and create space for both of them. And it requires legal pluralism to contend with ontological pluralism. And that's where, for example, you have the Te Awamutu Act, which is in relation to the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's not the only act in New Zealand which tries to do this in some way, but it is one that came about as part of a treaty settlement process because the iwi, the local tribe of the Wanganui, had been uh, struggling back against Crown control over the river and over the degradation of the river caused through that control for more than a century. And they'd tried warfare, they'd tried negotiation, they'd tried litigation, they'd tried protest, they'd tried petitioning the Queen. And then through this treaty settlement process, they, together with the Crown, came up with this legislation which tried a new model. And that legislation is best known for giving legal personhood to the river. That's the thing that catches the imagination of a
Yeah.
lot of particularly Western legal theorists because it seems very novel, and it has some significance from the kind of Christopher Stone, should trees have standing, seminal article from the 70s and all of those things. In fact, it drew on that partly as inspiration. But that mechanism is just an inroad into really a way of bringing two ontologies together and two legal systems together in the one piece of legislation and creating a really detailed governance and institutional framework to allow for that to really operate in practice. And that's going to take time. So, anyone who tells you that they're measuring whether it's successful or not now is probably a bit impatient because it's very early days. But what we're starting to see, and what seems to be happening, and this is not my country, so I can't tell you what's actually happening, but what's being reported from people there is that um, it's creating the space for new decisions to be made in a way that respects um, local law, kawa, but also that brings everyone in the community into a conversation and brings people together, I guess, in a very deliberative process so that they can actually start to make decisions together with their attention drawn to the question of, well, what's best for the river? How
Hmm.
can we make this decision in a way that's best for the river? Because ultimately that's going to serve us too. If the river is being served, the community is going to be served. And that's changing, it's changing the tone, the context, and the focus of conversations in that place.
Absolutely fascinating. In your written responses to my were published at the Water Shelf. Your written responses to interview questions I posed. I'd read an article about the Colorado River Indian tribe, the tribal council of the Colorado River Indian tribes declaring the Colorado River a legal person, and there's all sorts of drama going on about the Colorado River in Western United States. And your description there just made that finally make sense in my head, and hopefully in many heads as we deal with this major issue. And obviously, as all rivers are, in water, let's say sparse areas, the rivers can often be the sources of contention. But I think what you just described, they can also be understood as sources of life and as entities in and of themselves that need to be understood. But absolutely fascinating. Wow, thank you. I want to take all your classes. I need to. I need to go back to college. But I want to end our interview. I want to come back to your book itself. I love asking authors. We were talking about the materiality of water and rivers. Let's talk about the materiality of your book itself for just a brief, if we could. And what what was the process of getting your book published? And also, you talk in your written responses a number of books that really inspired you and other authors and co-authors that you've worked with that you see yourself in dialogue with. And talk a little bit about the materiality of your book itself, The Legal Geographies of Water.
Yeah, sure. So the the very backstory to my book is that my PhD thesis was about the human right to water. So the middle case studies of the book, Manila and Johannesburg, were the two case studies from my PhD. And when I finished my PhD, uh, I took 8 years because I had two babies. I took maternity leave. I went part-time. I moved countries 3 times. Um, so I submitted this thesis
And by
and
the
I
way,
did not.
it took me 13 years to get my PhD, so
Oh,
you're way ahead of me.
thank you.
Yeah.
When I got the examiner's report back, one of my examiners was very, very kind. And in addition to providing some changes, for the resubmission for completion, some fixing up some, nuancing some language and adding some sort of footnotes and things like that. He said, there are some bigger structural changes that I think would really benefit this when you publish it as a monograph. And so then he was incredibly generous and provided quite a number of pages of suggestions of how I could turn this thesis, which serves one audience,
Mhm.
into a book which would serve a bigger audience. And at the time, I struggled with both being incredibly grateful for that generosity and being somewhat outraged that anyone would think that I would touch that project with a 10-foot barge pole because I was so ready to do something different with my life. And so I didn't take up that offer. And I set that aside and I went into academia. And I did still write about the human right to water. I was quite interested, for example, in Flint and Detroit and Dublin, which also feature in the book. But I also became very interested in these conversations around the rights of rivers, um, and legal personhood and the significance of those as well. And then I guess Indigenous water governance and ontologies and things like that. And I always had this feeling that actually all of that was related to each other, that there was a thread that was maybe a river that brought all of those together. But when you publish in these different, a journal over here and a chapter over there and collaborations with different people, it's hard to bring those threads all together and to explain, I guess, some kind of, I mean, I think grand theories are probably a bit problematic, but something that brings those together and that shows why actually that they're coming at the same problem from different angles. They're trying to explain something from these different perspectives. So when an editor from Routledge, from Earthscan, contacted me to say, would you be interested in writing a book based on a couple of those chapters that I talked about? Um, I did think, oh, that would be an opportunity to sort of try to bring those threads together, as daunting as that seems. And at the time I thought, and I'm not really sure how would I do that? It's kind of like foolishly ambitious in terms of its big scope. um, and the reader would be quite confused. But at the time, I was writing another book, The Lawful Forest. And so I said, well, thank you so much. It's a really kind offer, but I'm in the middle of writing another book and it seems to be taking me a while. So I better not take something else on. And I mentioned to you in writing that she was extraordinarily both kind and extraordinarily persistent. So over about 2.5 years, she would just gently come back into my inbox and say, how about now? And I would say, still writing the book. um, and the last email she sent through was just after we had, in fact, submitted the final copy edits on the Lawful Forest. So that was done. Um, and I responded immediately and I said, I have in fact finished the book, but it's also made me realize that I really just need a break. I don't want to write another book right now. So I'm going to say absolutely no. No, I'm absolutely not going to take up this lovely offer of yours. And I went to bed that night and suddenly it all made sense. I could see I could see the story. I could see how I could tell it sort of chronologically, but across time and space with these different, international and case studies coming into conversation. And I actually really wanted to, or I really wanted to bring all those threads together. It seemed like something that otherwise I would feel like everything else was kind of sitting out there, disconnected from each other, and they needed to be brought together in conversation. So I got back to her the next day and I said, actually, I've changed my mind. Thank you so much. I would like to write the book. Um, and then we still went through the proper process. So I wrote a very detailed proposal and it went out to 4 peer reviewers who were really lovely and generous in their feedback and their encouragement. And it went from there with, of course, COVID contributing in its own way to the case studies and all the
Yes.
things. But eventually it came out in hardcover form. But I guess I wanted to acknowledge in my response to you before the fact that between the PhD and publishing that book, so much of my work has been collaborative. And that process, I love collaborating with other researchers. They're always smarter than me. And I learn so much from that process and all of those conversations and learnings and everything that comes from those collaborations inevitably contributed to the book to the point where when I published it, I kind of felt a little bit ridiculous just having my name on the front. It feels a little bit hubristic because it's so indebted to all of those other sort of that intellectual contribution from everyone that I've ever collaborated with. So I guess it's just me taking responsibility for the errors. So that's that's my name there.
I love that story. The foolish ambition to the epiphany, the scales from, all of a sudden you saw it all in one go, and obviously all the human relations to go with to understand the human water relations in this context. What an incredible story. Thank you, and I deeply appreciate you taking on that ambition to write such an incredibly important book. I would say in helping, I would say lots of us understand. And I know you mentioned in your written interview that it's kind of for the the legal nerds, but that you really want there to be a broad audience, and I think you achieved that. This is a very highly readable, understandable, mind expanding understanding of the human relationship to water and all of its very complexities and even multiple realities. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes to talk to us about it, and I hope everyone rushes out to grab a copy. I've been speaking, delighted to speak with Dr. Cristy Clark about her relatively new book that is on the shelves, The Legal Geographies of Water, the Spaces, Places, and Narratives of the Human Water Relations. Strongly urge you to check it out, enjoy it, and help understand your own ontology of water, as well as the how water and human relations work across the globe. Cristy, thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Water Shelf. For water book news and reviews and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit the Water Shelf website at mavensnotebook.com/watershelf. Maven's Notebook is the place to stay up to date on California water news and information. Subscribe to weekly or daily emails at mavensnotebook.com. Finally, please support authors by filling your water shelf with their amazing books. Buy them at your local bookseller and let me know what you think. Until next time, thank you for listening and happy water reading.